intro to React, and then we're going to have Davey come in and you guys are going to build a React application. Woohoo. Okay, so first, what is React? Who wants to read this? Okay.
What is React? A declarative, efficient, and flexible JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It encourages the creation of reusable UI components that present data that changes over time.
Awesome, thank you. So declarative, efficient, flexible, reusable UI components. We're going to talk a little bit about each of those things over the next few minutes. But basically, last week we were working directly with the DOM, manipulating the DOM to change the user interface. Now we're going to be using React. So when we say React is declarative, what does that mean exactly? In computer programming, people talk about different languages as either declarative or imperative, but what does that really mean? So when you say imperative, you're describing how to do something. So basically, as a programmer, you have to tell the program the exact specification, the process that you want it to do. When it's a declarative language, you just make a declaration. You just say what you want it to do. So for example, if Davey and I are going to a restaurant, we're going to lunch, and I arrive at the hostess stand and I say, hello, we're here for lunch. Can you please grab 2 menus, grab 2 sets of silverware, walk us over to that table over there, set the menus down, maybe open the menus, place the silver on the table, bring extra napkins because Davey's messy. Welcome us to the restaurant, tell us who our server's going to be, and then walk away as we sit down. Is that imperative or declarative? That's imperative. I'm telling her how to do it, right? Declarative would be, hi, we'd like a table for 2, please. So another example between declarative and imperative is driving a car. Who knows the difference between a manual and an automatic car? So with a manual car, you have to put it in first gear. You have to use the clutch, take your foot off the clutch, press on the gas, change it to the second gear, third gear. With an automatic car, I just say, put it in drive. I learned on a manual car, but yeah. So the automatic car, that's what? Just put it in drive. It's declarative. I just tell it what I want it to do, drive. So that's what I mean by declarative when we talk about React. So an example for a web page is something like this. This is imperative. I'm saying, okay, create a new variable called multiply array. Assign it the value of an empty array. Create a new variable I. Assign it the value of 0. As long as I is less than the length of the original array, run this block of code. Each time, increase I by 1. Create a new variable, multiply number. Set it equal to the original array at that index number and multiply it by 3. Push that into, that's a lot. That's telling it how to do that. This is declarative. Take the original array, map over it, and multiply that number by 3. Yep, same thing. It's just a more declarative way of writing that code. So it's declarative. It's also efficient. So React has something called the virtual DOM. So we've been working with the DOM. What React does is it takes a snapshot of that DOM, creates its own virtual DOM, and then it only re-renders the part of that page that has changed. So when we're working with the real DOM, the regular DOM, the OG DOM, it'll re-render the whole page every time something changes. But with React, it only re-renders those objects that have changed. So it's really efficient. And it also, in React, we use what's called reusable components. So we create small components and we could reuse them. For example, a header. Let's say you have a 5 or 6 page application and they all have headers every page. Well, in the past, we would probably have to write that code 5 or 6 different times for each page. With React, we could just make a component, write that code once, and then just import that component onto those different pages, or views, as we call them. Okay, so to build a React application, you really only need 4 things. The first thing is you need an HTML page with at least one empty element. Typically, that element is just a div, and typically it has an ID of root, and we'll show you that in a minute. You need to import the React library. We'll show you how to do that. You need 1 or more React components, typically more. And then you need a JavaScript call that attaches that React component to the HTML element from step 1. Okay, so I've been using the word component a lot. So what does that mean? So this is an example of some typical HTML. We've been writing it over the last few weeks, or week for you. But wouldn't it be cool if we could just write this in its place? So again, like that example I said, we have that header. We would have to write this, 5 or 6 different times, but instead we could just inject this. It's a customized tag that we create. That's what a component is. So this is what a React component looks like. So there's 2 different types. There's class components and then there's stateless functional components, but right now I'll just describe the class one. So React component, it's a class. We give it the name app header in this case. It extends from react.component, which that is from the React library that we import. And then every class component has a render method on it. And that render method returns what looks like HTML, but it's actually called JSX. So JSX is JavaScript XML. Who can find 2 things that are different between regular HTML or that you wouldn't see in regular HTML, but you could see here? Troy.
Instead of on the ordered list, it's class name instead of class.
Right. Why do you think we have class name?
Aren't we already using class for the app header?
Yep. So class is a reserved word in JavaScript. So we can't just use class in our markup. We have to use class name. So that's one difference.
You're using the curly brackets, the this.props.name.
Yes. So we're actually injecting some JavaScript expression within our markup. So like last week, we had a JavaScript file. We had a HTML file. We kept those separate. In React, you actually combine that logic with that UI rendering logic. So you can have JavaScript expressions within your JavaScript or within your JSX. You just have to put them around with curly braces around them. And that's how you inject that in. So really, again, it looks like HTML. It's actually JSX, which compiles down to JavaScript. So under the hood, that H1 in JSX actually becomes this. This is what you're actually writing or what's happening under the hood. It's this react.create element, and you pass it 3 arguments. But we don't want to have to write all that. So we just write that, and there's a preprocessor within React that just compiles it down to JavaScript. So this, we could just write this instead of having to write all this. And this is just like the first few lines of that. So that's just for your knowledge. That's what's happening under the hood. Again, you don't have to write it in JSX. You can write it like this. It just takes a lot of time and no one really does it. So we use JSX in React.
Is it as if it's running HTML inside a virtual machine?
Say that again?
Is it as if it's running HTML inside a virtual machine?
I don't know if I understand that question.
I think the answer is no.
Yeah, so we're using JSX here, injecting a little bit of JavaScript to render different data.
The deal is the JSX you write gets turned into actual JavaScript because JSX doesn't run in the browser. We'll go into more detail when we actually build it.
Okay, so one of the big concepts in React are props. So props are short for properties. So if you think of a React component as just a JavaScript function, you could pass in props just like you pass arguments into functions, right? And props can be anything. They could be strings, objects, booleans, functions. So here's an example of that. At the top, we just have a function called alertMe. In the middle, we have our React component. This component is called myComponent. It has a render method. It returns some JSX. And then down here is how you would call that component or place that component within your app. So here's the name of the component. Basically, you're kind of creating your own custom tag. And then these are the 3 props. So into this component, we're passing the prop alertMe, myfave, and name. AlertMe is the function alertMe. Myfave is the boolean true. And then name is the string Emilio. So now this component, my component, has access to these 3 props because I passed them in. Okay, just like you would a function, you pass that argument into a function, you're passing these 3. So you could pass in whatever you want. Okay, and you could call it whatever you want. We chose to call them alertMe, myfave, and name. And this value is what's going to be replaced, for example, in the onClick method or in the onClick function. This .props.alertMe, that's the value that's going to be passed in there, right? My name is this .props.name. That's the value that's going to be passed in. And this .props is how you access the props that get passed in. Questions on this slide? Yeah. So I think anything but strings needs brackets. Okay, so the thing about props is they're immutable. They can't be changed. So you pass things down as props if it's just data that you don't need changed. If you do need it, so Emilio will always be Emilio. Right? Name will always be Emilio in this case because we're passing it as a prop. You cannot change it within that component. If you want to change it later, you need to do that using state. And that's another big concept of React. So if a component needs to keep track of and modify being the keyword, its own data, then we use state. And state is initialized in a component's constructor, just like, do you remember the constructor we used in the last project for the class? I'll show you. And it's modified using the setState method. So for example, the top, we have our React component, clicky counter. We have a constructor method, and then we initialize state by calling this.state equals the object that has a property count, which starts at 0. So the constructor is where you initialize the state. So if you have properties that you want to change or data that you want to change, stick it in state, give it an initial value, and then later when you want that value to change, if you look at the update count method, that's when you call this.setState, which is just a built-in method in React, and that's what updates or changes state. So in this case, we want to change the property count of state. And so just like we use this.props, we use this.state.count. So then here in our render method, when we're rendering the button, it has an onClick function. It calls this.updateCount because if it's a method on a class, you have to use this dot. And that's when you change the state, the value of count. Does that make sense? Questions? Okay, and the last of the 4 things that we need for a React app is to attach it to the DOM. So this is something that you'll only do once in your application. And really, if you're building the React application by running the command create React app, it does it for you. But just so you know. So this top part is just your regular index.html file. And within the body of this HTML, you'll see a div with an ID of root. It's most typical you'll see that. It'll be an empty div. And then at the very end, the bottom of this slide, you call this, you have this JavaScript call, React DOM.render, and then you tell it, okay, what component do I want you to render? The app component. And where do I want you to render it? Find the ID, find the element in the HTML with the ID of root and put it there. So basically, in your React application, you have this like root component. Typically it's called app. Maybe it's called main, but usually it's app. And then all the other components kind of extend from there. And that just gets put into the HTML, and that's how React knows what to render. Mm-hmm.
So that JavaScript code is existing within the HTML code.
No. So the HTML, the top part, everything above class, is going to be in a public folder in the index.html file. This last line will typically be in an index.js file in your application. And then this middle part is going to be a component. And it doesn't have to be, but typically components each have their own JavaScript file.
You'll see when we actually make something.
Earlier when you showed like the class that was extending, we extended like React.component as opposed to this component.
Mm-hmm.
Is that is it for the main one that we don't do the React.component, or is it
You'll see this with Davy. Basically, like, it's a component is a named export that you could pull out and like at the top import React and the named export component. So you don't have to say React.component. You could just say component. But he'll kind of explain that as he's demonstrating it for you.
Really, they're both React.
Right. Okay, guys. That's all I have. Let me know if you have any questions. And now Davy's going to do a code pen example, I think, for you. Awesome.